I'm pleased to introduce our second panel of this morning, where we'll be focusing on cybersecurity and the governance of cyberspace in times of geopolitical instability. This panel will look at Russia's recent proposal for a convention of the UN on ensuring international information security and the ongoing cybercrime convention negotiations, which are due to conclude in February next year. The panel will also consider the governance of cyberspace in war, particularly cyberspace as a form of warfare. And I'm pleased to say that we have an excellent panel of speakers for this session. I'm pleased to welcome our first panellist, Bojana Bellamy, President of the Centre for Information and Policy Leadership. Our chair for this session is David Carroll, Managing Director of Nominet Cyber, and our second panellist is James Shires, Senior Research Fellow at Cyber Policy at Chatham House. Thank you very much.
It's one.
Is that it? Fantastic. Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to chair this panel today. It's very exciting, and I think very excited to be joined by Bojana and James. And we are going to talk about cybersecurity and the governance of cyberspace during times of geopolitical instability. We are going to go a little bit wider than some of the, I think there are a couple of policy initiatives, proposal by Russia and a piece of work that's being done at the United Nations Ad Hoc Committee. We're going to go a little bit wider than that. We're going to take a bit of a liberty there. I hope that's okay, because there's quite a wide range of policy initiatives that are currently in flight. And I thought I'd start with a few comments before I turn to my panelists. It's 5 years since Eric Schmidt made his apocryphal remark, his famous prediction that by 2028 we would see two distinct internets, one led by the United States and the other led by China. And that was a prediction that was subsequently echoed by the then CEO of the UK National Cybersecurity Centre, Kieran Martin. And he went further. He offered that potentially we could end up with two or possibly even three internets, not all of them built along Californian lines of openness and transparency, but with others potentially built on very different, perhaps more authoritarian lines. So the potential implications of such a prediction, were it to come true, would be profound, to say the least, for our national security, for our economies and societies, for our ability to harness the new possibilities that are created by the convergence of large data sets and emerging technologies such as AI, profound implications as well for human rights and for our privacy and for our personal freedoms. Now, geopolitically, a lot has happened since Mr. Schmidt made his 2018 prediction. We've had a global pandemic and the economic shockwaves thereupon. We've seen a deterioration of US and China relations, which Henry Kissinger now describes as being in the foothills of a new Cold War. There are increased tensions over Taiwan, and there is a decoupling of certain technology supply chains, especially high-end semiconductors. We seem to be also experiencing a degree of global divergence on data, privacy, and technical standards. And of course, there has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So geopolitical tensions are heightened in ways not seen for decades. At the same time, there are several global cybersecurity policy initiatives and internet governance proposals in motion across a range of institutions and nations. So on the panel today, we're going to attempt to, in the short space of time available to us, we're going to try to make sense of these and to navigate some of the big questions. What's at stake and what are the big issues? Secondly, what are these big policy initiatives? What do they seek to achieve? Who are the participants? How much relative influence do they have? What are the main areas of agreement and disagreement? And what are their chances of success? And then finally, just for fun, I'm going to put Bojana and James on the spot, and I'm going to ask them to attempt to cast their minds forward and ask, are geopolitical divisions set to make the internet ungovernable? Do we think we'll see a bifurcation or even a splintering of the internet as predicted? So I'm going to come to James first, if I may, and ask, James, from your perspective, what are the big issues? And I'm going to borrow from your own 4 forms of cybersecurity initially around the kind of implications for cyber conflict and national security, for foreign interference, for human rights and privacy, and for information controls and democratic freedoms. So there's a lot to think about there. What are the big issues?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you very much for all dialing in online or being here in person. It's a big question, and there's plenty to talk about in terms of geopolitical instability. I will start by highlighting 5 changes in the major geopolitical landscape beyond cybersecurity and the governance of cyberspace. And then, as David has kindly suggested, I'll narrow down into their implications for cyber governance and cybersecurity. The first is a renewed threat of serious conflict between superpowers. We have, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia ongoing since 2022, with increasing support from NATO states to Ukraine on the other side. There are threats to nuclear reactors in Ukraine, and rhetoric, especially from the Russian side, that no options are off the table in terms of escalation. This is somewhere that we have not been for many years. Since the Cold War, the use of nuclear weapons in conflict has been almost a taboo, and we are looking at actors threatening to break that taboo. Not going so far as to do so, but this could be catastrophic. This is not just geopolitical instability, this is serious existential risk to humans and other life on the planet. So David said don't get too gloomy, so I thought I'd start there and then work upwards. The second point here is, more widely, we have a state of geopolitical competition. Whereas you might see the rosy days of the early internet age as being one where organizations, especially companies, could trade and build their markets freely around the world. This is becoming increasingly difficult to do so. Trade barriers exist, often for national security reasons, both in China, in the US, and in Europe as well. And so the blurring of economic competition and national security reasons for preventing corporate access from foreign countries into certain national markets are really closely intertwined. And it's that juxtaposition between national security and economic security is one that is increasingly going to play out over the next few years, whether it's in semiconductors, which you already mentioned, in other forms of internet infrastructure, Huawei being the case on one side, the Clean Network Initiative being the case on the other, or more generally in terms of new and emerging technologies. We had a whole panel on AI, and obviously the investment in AI skills, in data and algorithms is going to define the cutting edge of technology and where that sits geopolitically for years to come. In terms of, to move slightly away in terms of geopolitical challenges, we then have sustainable development. Right? We're not. It's very important for these kinds of conversations not to get stuck on the superpower tussles. Most of the world looks on at places like Ukraine with shock, with fear for their implications for things like grain prices, for staples. Egyptian bread rises significantly. The price rises when you have import difficulties, but they don't see the same attention or the same concern being paid elsewhere in the world. Right? We've also had reactionary coup or civil war developing in Sudan, with implications for internet access and human rights there as well. But in many, many other conflict situations and crisis situations around the world. And so having an effective development agenda and regime worldwide, which both focuses on decreasing instability in developing countries and giving them access to technologies, to digital means to grow their economies, to give individuals access to information, is a really important part of the coming geopolitical landscape. And that's, of course, not to mention the importance of this being sustainable development. Right? We will be increasingly faced with climate risks in a climate change world, and digital technologies, including those with significant cybersecurity risks, will be used to monitor and to gather data on this as well. Finally, I'll end by talking about the information space more generally. The kinds of conflict that I mentioned are ones that, even though they are new in character, might have been recognized by observers and analysts sitting in Chatham House or places like that 50 years ago or 100 years ago. They might not have recognized the challenges that we face in terms of misinformation, disinformation, algorithmically influenced virality, difficulties in young people having the right media education, having buying into online worlds, committing themselves to virtual lives, and suffering harms as a result of that in ways that probably could not have been dreamt of a century ago. So that's the final major challenge. What's at stake here? I think if we combine all those things together, we see that cyberspace, of course, is central to all of these, whether through conflict, cyber operations in conflict, whether through digital development, or through the competition over technologies. And cybersecurity itself is going to play a central role in both enabling countries to either stay out of or minimize levels of competition and conflict, and also to enable individuals to have full access to their rights and freedoms.
Thanks, James. I think that's a really interesting point that you make there around, we sometimes frame this almost with a kind of Cold War mindset into the great superpowers fighting for the future of the internet, but actually, there are about to be another billion internet users joining that community, and there's the whole of the non-aligned world who are not necessarily going to be falling into either camp, and are going to have a big say about the future of the internet. Bojana, I'll come to you if I may. I know you're very interested in the data and privacy perspective and the big issues regarding where that overlaps with security. So where do you see the big issues?
So thank you very much again, David, James. Pleasure to be here with you on this panel, but also this really is an important fora. In fact, it's the kind of fora we need because these things can't be solved in silos, in company offices or think tanks or government departments as well. So let me sort of now, James, what you've set out for us is really fantastic because I can now juxtaposition that, whatever the word is, onto sort of the digital policy data world that I live in. And I lead a think tank which works with companies as well as policy lawmakers on ensuring responsible use of data, responsible development of technology in a way that protects privacy, but also builds convergence globally and engagement as well. So I'm trying to influence all sides to see the different way. And here is what I'm sort of learning from these discussions. And I speak a lot with boards as well as senior executives. And they are realizing the geopolitical tension. Of course, it is probably first in the supply chain, but we are now telling them actually it's about data digital. It's about what your strategy is all about. All companies are going through this digital transformation, so it's incredibly relevant where data is, what can you share, what can you access, how you understand your own commitment to responsible data use as well. So first of all, data is, as I often say, is this bipolar. Data is incredibly beneficial. All of the benefits, powers AI, powers governments, effective governments, powers new services and products, enables individuals to participate in education, democracy, enables data altruism. But on the other hand, this data is very toxic. It's heavily regulated in a way that is actually fragmented, that creates burdens and barriers, and I'll talk about them. It is a massive risk. It's an asset, but it's a risk, because when you lose it, or when somebody takes your major asset or makes threat to it, that's a major business continuity issue, and also for governments as well. So I think everybody's now realizing that data is a major asset. It's actually John Edwards, Information Commissioner, said it's a major asset that is not on companies' account sheets, and it should be, right? It really should be. And that's what we're trying to kind of, wake up everybody and say, this is something that you need to worry and take care about. But equally, governments need to worry and take on in terms of their policy. And in particular, when I say it's asset, it is actually going to be essential for as we have heard in the previous panel, proper functioning of AI, machine learning, is going to be essential, as we're going to hear this panel, for proper cybersecurity, data sharing, and understanding the threats and dealing with them. So it is a huge asset, and we need to be able to collect, share data in a responsible way for all these reasons that are to do with business strategy, government strategy, and areas like cyber and AI. It is therefore part of the industrial policy, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, and it should be. And sometimes, you hear some executives saying, well, there is no digital industrial policy, there should be. Well, I think governments are changing that. I mean, they're realizing the cybersecurity threats, so, they're all setting national cybersecurity policies, but they're also setting this digital policy, data policy in a different way. And UK certainly has got that, and with the DCIT, I think it's going to be really positive. I know you've asked Neil Ross that question. I think it's going to be a positive focus on this, and this absolutely has to happen. And those countries that actually see that as a part of industrial policy will actually reap benefits. Now, it is also led to what I call this digital regulatory tsunami. So it's not just data protection and privacy, it's also cybersecurity, but it's also content and platform regulation that is popping up. You might have heard we talk about D-files and deregulation in EU, the DMA, DSA, DGA, Data Act, and then AI, GDPR, and cyber. But all of these laws are now being replicated around the world. So we've got regulation of platforms and online content and safety. You have regulation of use of data, privacy, data protection, which is also a fundamental human right. Please, let's not forget that. It's in many countries in the world, data protection is a fundamental human right. We've got regulation DMA style, which is all about competition and opening and sharing data, enabling data portability. Then you've got the Data Act, which is about sharing between public and private sector. And it's DGA, which is about sharing of public sector data, health data spaces. So, and then of course, AI Act, you've heard about that. There is still cybersecurity regulation. So I often ask myself, how do you get all these different policy aspects, this tsunami, to really mean something? What does it really mean? So I think that requires much more holistic approach, both at governmental level, but also at corporate level, because we have to think about all of these regulations together and not duplicate and triplicate. And that's happening, I'm afraid, at the moment in particular. Then there are some other big trends that are happening in data and digital space in the world. And one is, you've heard that from Neil, is data localization. As governments realize the power of data, they feel this is an asset that they should actually, for all kinds of reasons, keep it within their own countries and not allow sharing of or keep a copy of. Many of this is driven by the national security. Certainly, I would say the data localization requirements that came as a result of, for example, in Russia or China are to do with government access to data and national security. India potentially both that and the economic sort of wish to retain and keep the data so that we don't have this data colonialism or neo-colonialism. I really think this is also something that we in the Western world have to think about. And I really feel passionate, and I'll say this later, that we really do need a new deal for data, because the only way to combat data localization is to ensure fair access and justifiable use of data by everybody, global south and north, west and east, and in a way that actually satisfies everybody. And I think that's possible, because ultimately if we start building these barriers, there really will not be internet at all, global internet. There will be internets and different, it's almost like metaverse, it's like, different realities. And I don't think that's what we really want. And with data localizations then come sort of restrictions on data flows. And those are not always done for the same reasons as data localization, but the effect is the same. And, EU has been, for example, accused of having very strict rules on data sharing across borders, requiring adequate equivalent, essential equivalent protection. And that's very difficult to achieve in this world, which really is a multipolar world. It's not two-polar, it's multipolar. And we have to realize that people can achieve the same goals in different ways, right? It can't be always cut and paste, GDPR style. And the more we have these restrictions, they are not there again, as the European Commission often says to us, it is not protectionist, but it appears to be protectionist to many of those who are now faced with yet another transatlantic problem, or indeed problem of exporting European data and having to think about European-only services, imaging, re-imaging, creating cloud data centers in Europe as well. So those restrictions are on the rise. The adequacy system is growing. So about 120 plus countries have got similar arrangements for adequacy, and there's some other legal requirements. And I want to tell you, as somebody who's actually worked in the industry and has been dealing with data flows, frankly, all my life, it was my first job was to actually give a piece of advice on data flows. At 25 plus years later, I shall not say 20 years later, I'm still that young. We're still dealing with this, and we haven't sussed it out. And it's a massive drain on resources where I actually feel companies should be spending time on responsible AI, responsible development of technologies, being accountable, Claire, right? And being able to demonstrate that. But they're actually dealing with data flow mechanisms and legal shenanigans almost, right? And so, the data protection framework that has been agreed between EU, US is very important, but what about the rest of the world? Honestly, we need a multilateral solution. We can't just deal one country by one country. Data is not just going to the US. Please bear that in mind. It's going everywhere and it's being accessed everywhere. McKinsey talks about repeatedly from 2016, about every 3 years they have a new survey which confirms that data flows are surpassing the trade in goods and services. Trade in goods, and that's incredible, right? There is some further data research that shows that if we were to have localized services, we would actually pay 60% more for the IT costs. Well, how is that going to help any SME, any startup who is trying to get on this scale? If we want to create the Googles of future in Europe, which seems to be part of geopolitics, right, James? Well, then we have to enable these companies to scale up and to have the access to people, markets, supply chain, data centers, and data globally. We can't ignore the economics, right? It's the economics. Stupid, right, that somebody has said. And we really can't ignore the economics and the importance of data flows. Now, to add to this mix of kind of geopolitical and data problems is that there has been a huge focus, and I think rightly so, on how governments and national security agencies use data. And the governmental access to data has become a big barrier to data flows, because rightly some countries do not trust the others. You can ask the question whether these are the right relationships and right mistrusts, or there are other countries that should be mistrusted. But we've seen that, right, with European Court of Justice ruling, and this kind of is trickling everywhere. So you see in British Columbia, in Canada, you see discussions. In China, you see questions asked. In Brazil, whether the data should be actually stored anywhere else, and how whether our companies should be operating in a way that enables other governments to access this data. So this is a very difficult question, and it's one that really companies cannot solve on their own. It's a question of geopolitics and international order and international law. So I'm really encouraged, and I hugely applaud the work that has been done. You asked us, David, to talk about some good initiatives, the work that has been done by the OECD on 38 countries plus the EU have agreed on the 7 basic principles for governmental access to data that all the signatories to OECD should adhere to and implement in their legal systems. I think this is a great step that we need to replicate and expand, right? So we want more countries adhering to these systems because that provides the legal certainty and the trust that we need for this new deal for data, the new Bretton Woods. So, really is hugely important. Final point, if I can just address, which is sort of the other initiatives that we think are going to be helpful and that are in this doom and gloom, I think are gathering momentum. And the first one is the sort of G20, G7. And I know that's just the one part of the world, and I actually feel very passionately that this is a global issue. We need really global solution beyond G7, G20, but we have to start somewhere. Since Premier Abe started this sort of movement and call for action for data-free flows with trust, we've seen quite a lot of discussions and debates, and every G7 meeting has been picking this up, and now it's starting to get operationalized. Countries of G7 are committed to this. There will be new institutional arrangements as well to push this data-free flow with trust. I think that really is important, and we need to support that. I would also love to see more multilateral approaches to data flows. As I say, moving away from these adequacy and essential equivalency. We can't have essentially equivalent laws because our constitutional systems are different, but we need to trust each other that the outcomes are going to be similar. And this is a very important debate in the UK-EU relationship, and that's another geopolitical tension that kind of adds to this really complicated mix. So I do hope that things like cross-border privacy rules, which are interesting mechanism that's going global, can be seen as a model for the future. And what that requires is leadership from companies, and I'll address that later. I know, David, you'll ask me about that, but also governments. So I am supportive hugely of what UK is trying to do, but also we've heard France, we've heard, US, EU, that there are lots of governments which kind of see the need for dealing with this thing in a new way. And I think the more we try to get like-minded countries together to look at this together, including cybersecurity, the better it's going to be. And I really want to make a huge pledge. We really need data in order to ensure cybersecurity. We need data in order to ensure responsible AI. And we can't always use these privacy-enhancing, expensive technologies that we heard about. This is the luxury of only top tech giants, and we are working on this. In fact, we've got a project on privacy preserving technologies, but it is a luxury product. It's not going to be available off the shelf for SMEs and startups. So we need to find a way to actually democratize that as well and incentivize companies to do better, and governments should be doing that. So that's the role for me for governments as well in this very complicated
it is
multipolar
indeed.
world.
I thank you, Bojana. You make some very important points there, particularly like your new deal for data, and I think I share your frustration. This should have been put to bed a long time ago, and it would have made our lives a lot easier, but it hasn't. So, we're having to deal with the consequences. I think you make a very important point
we'll
about...
have jobs for life.
I think you make a very important point about how, we need to do this, we need to do it right, and government and industry need to do it together. Otherwise, others will, and that could be suboptimal. So, James, we've heard a little bit about some of the big data policy initiatives. Turning to the cybersecurity side of life, what are the big global cybersecurity policy initiatives? Give us a quick burst on, what are they seeking to achieve? It's not just about the Russian and the UN ad hoc committee. There's more to it than that. But what's the general direction of travel? What are we seeking to achieve? And what do you kind of sense of where does the power lie? Because this is not all about governments. It's about big tech as well. Let's have your thoughts.
Thank you. So I'll split the remarks in two. The first half will be focused on the UN system, for those of you who have experienced it and its wonderful intricacies. You can tune away now. For everyone else, this might be more exciting. And then the second half will look at things that are outside the UN. And before I begin, it's worth just framing the conversation a little bit more broadly. We should, before I get into the details of various acronyms and what's going on in different UN processes, Bojana mentioned Bretton Woods, right? And that was the creation of the liberal international order, including the United Nations. We should also step back and think, what is the UN for at this moment? Is it delivering those promises, right? When we look at things like the Security Council, where you have repeated vetoes, you have almost entire stalemate, questions about whether it should be expanded or disbanded or something else that rhymes. Works like that. We also have the Human Rights Council, right, which again has been well publicized in terms of its relevance to human rights per se. So the UN is really struggling to define itself for the long-term future. And within this broader context, we have multiple cybersecurity and cybercrime processes, beginning from over 20 years ago with small groups of governmental experts, expanding into open-ended working groups, discussing things like capacity building, the role of international law in constraining and shaping state behavior in cyberspace. And now that kind of discussion, to say where we're going now, is becoming more concrete, right? It's maybe moving to an implementation phase. This is the idea behind what is now called the program of action, that it becomes on a more rolling basis something that states can draw on to improve their cybersecurity at a national level and participate in international dialogues. Now, separate to that, we have also had a 20, 30 year plus conversation on global or multilateral cybercrime cooperation. The landmark there a couple of years ago being the Budapest Convention with the Council of Europe. And I was really happy that Bojana mentioned the G7 and G20, because if you look into the weeds of the origin of the Budapest Convention and the 24/7 network and things like that, you find the G7 and G20 groups of experts playing a really influential role in the mid-90s when that comes to light. But now there's also a UN global multilateral process, the ad hoc committee on cybercrime. It's had 2 years of negotiations coming to a head fairly shortly, with the next session in August and then the planned final session in January next year. We have a draft text of the treaty, which covers not only what a cybercrime is, so what will be criminalized under the convention for all states, but also things like international cooperation and required procedural measures for access to data, content data, traffic data, storing of data, search and seizure of premises that have data on them, right? Things that states will have to institute in their laws and enable cooperation with other states to exchange these forms of data. So this speaks directly to what Bojana was talking about in terms of a changed landscape for companies engaging with each other on what is possible technically and economically in terms of their viable markets, right? The AHC, in terms of its international cooperation mandates, will change how especially service providers, but also technology companies more broadly, can share and utilize data. Now, stepping beyond that, we of course do have a Russian proposal for a convention on cybersecurity. For me, this is both a new thing and also not a new thing. It's what began the whole GG process in the late 90s, and what we've seen, especially with the Cybercrime Convention in the ad hoc committee, that again this started with a Russian not only proposal but a draft text, that was very effectively changed to accommodate other views, not only the more Western Budapest Convention views, but also Global South, developing world views as well. and the AHC, having participated in some sessions, is very much a global conversation. There are clear divides. The Ukraine war has made the atmosphere of the sessions much darker. Many interventions condemn Russia's invasion and therefore lead to a relatively hostile atmosphere between these two parties. It's also worth saying that these negotiations at the UN have been affected by the pandemic. We haven't talked too much about the pandemic, but they were initially online and then hybrid, and it's much more difficult to actually conduct negotiations in that setting. It's more prepared statements, no one can read the room, there's less room for negotiation as well. So maybe the more in-person sessions now will change that. Finally, I'm going to, this is still on the UN, by everyone, right? We're going to talk a bit about the Global Digital Compact, right? These are very much narrow cybersecurity and cybercrime processes. Adding them together with big technology issues like AI, like data governance more generally, is the aim of the proposed Global Digital Compact. It's the aim of the US Special Envoy for Technology, and this is all building up to shaping the UN or trying to reorient it as an influential voice in technology governance more broadly. Finally, to look elsewhere, I could talk about the non-UN processes for much longer than the UN, but I will save you that because you know as well as I do, the multi-stakeholder nature of internet governance and the fact that private sector companies, that non-profit internet governance bodies are just as crucial. I will highlight a couple of key moments here, though. One, and they're very different. One is the ICANN decision not to disallow or remove Russia from the global DNS after its 2022 invasion. Right? This highlights on one side the fragility of our current internet governance model, that we depend on these organizations to make decisions like that, not to fracture the internet at a very fundamental level, but also that it is very much a non-geopolitical motivation as well. We have an extremely polarized environment with horrific atrocities being committed on the ground, and there are people who are still thinking about the global benefit or the global benefit of a global internet in that context. So there are some long-term views there as well. The other point I will make is the relevance of non-UN and even non-state actors is in the context of global spyware proliferation. Right? A very different context. You see major scandals erupting around not only human rights violations, but also national security concerns from states, from commercial spyware being sold and used by other states. Now, the main actors here are not states. They are either NGOs at universities, things like Citizen Lab, who are exposing these spyware companies, or they are big tech companies mounting lawsuits and public campaigns, whether through the Cyber Tech Accord or whether it's WhatsApp mounting lawsuits in the US. And that now leads on to influence on state and multilateral governance with the European PEGA Committee and so on. So even outside the UN process, outside the state process, we see a lot of initiatives changing in terms of the more concrete and specific issues in cyberspace, cybersecurity.
Thank you, James. I have about 100 questions I'd like to ask you. In the interest of moving us along towards questions, I'm going to save those and come back to you. I'm especially interested to talk about the role of the private sector in this process and what the big hyperscalers are up to. But I'm going to draw us towards our third question, if that is okay. And I'm going to ask you both to kind of cast your minds forward with regards to both data and privacy and cybersecurity and the geopolitics of it. What are you expecting to see in the near term and in the longer term? We could well start with the findings of the UN Ad Hoc Committee in whether that text will be ratified in January, February of next year. But I'd also be interested in hearing, where do you think we'll be in 2028? By which time Eric Schmidt's time will be up. James, I'll start with you, if I may.
Sure. So in terms of a global governance landscape, I think we will see more binding treaties. Whether the AHC, whether something that comes out of a convention, whether something that comes out of the Global Digital Compact, whatever it is, that will happen. Now, the devil of these is always in the detail, right? So they depend on ratification, they depend on implementation. Even the wording of these is often very conditional. So sometimes states may or shall do certain things. So even when these texts exist, which they currently don't, there's a big gap between that happening and better cybersecurity on one hand, or the pernicious side effects of such texts on permitting information controls, preventing free flows of data, or more generally human rights violations from state overreach. So that will happen, but I don't see in the near term, even 2028, that these processes will really be enforceable globally, right? So states, I think, will have enough room to choose where they fit themselves, and they will generally stay within the aligned buckets that we see now. In terms of the role of the private sector, I see a increasing sort of not only consolidation in technology companies, but also consolidation throughout the stack as well. So companies investing in infrastructure down to the physical level, down to the cable level, but also combining that with cloud services, with specific applications. So you have a whole ecosystem within a company that gives them certain advantages, right? We haven't even talked about encryption debates, right? But if you have both endpoints in a cloud system, then you can also have end-to-end encryption with no lack of sort of commercial sort of data analytics. But that will make it much harder for individuals and countries to have multiple providers in one system. They will generally choose one or the other, and they might be aligned with, say, the US or China, or should Bojana's sort of hypothesized European hyperscaler come into existence, then it would be that one too. And then finally, in terms of fragmentation, what does the internet look like from the point of view of the normal average individual across the world, right? It will look very different from very different places. Whether this is the apps you use, the kind of access to data you have, the protections around the data, the limits to where you can take your devices, the kind of even the hardware on the devices themselves. But for me, that is an acceleration of a trend that already exists, right? We have never had an internet that looks the same across the world since the beginning of the Great Firewall. So that is something that is an acceleration, not fragmentation.
I think that's a very important point that you make. In some respects, this stuff's already happening and always has been around for a long time. Thank you, James. So same question to you, Bojana.
Yes.
If you have your crystal ball, what are you seeing?
I see. So, but by the way, James, you've sort of started that conversation when you talk about sustainability agenda, and I wonder whether this kind of proliferation of technologies that and multiple internets and multiple stacks will also be will be hindering our sustainability goals. And I actually think we need to start talking like that as well, kind of, and link that sustainability agenda with data and digital agenda, because we can't have hundreds of data centers. It actually doesn't work. Actually, cybersecurity is worse if you have 100 data centers as well. I mean, we just have to be so open, and we have to listen to the experts who are saying these things. So maybe it will be helpful that will help us slow some of that balkanization. But I think we will have to learn to look at multiple rights, David, and multiple interests. I feel our world has been very siloed siloed, and regulators, policymakers are always thinking about just one thing at a time. It's privacy or cybersecurity, or it's privacy or it's encryption. It's safety or it's something. It's children's protection here, but children's got best interests as well. So we can't do that anymore. We have to stop making policy and laws in silos. We have to think holistically and learn to balance different rights. No one right is more important than the other. And COVID showed us that. We learned something in COVID, and I just would like us to go back to that modus operandi, where we can move faster and we can move better when we sort of, shed some of the bureaucracy and unnecessary things and really be maybe risk a bit more risk taking. I kind of feel we have to be more risk taking, and I think companies will have to do that as well. And to your point, what do companies do? I feel there is a shift taking place where it isn't just about legal compliance anymore. It's about existential business sustainability. Will we have a business in the future if this is not trusted, responsible business and business that understands the geopolitics and can play these geopolitics right? We at CIPL have been advocating for a long time organizational accountability. So it's time to actually step that up. Corporate digital responsibility. If you are a big tech player, you have got massive responsibility and you have to behave in that way. And in fact, we are seeing that. I think AI is going to help us with that debate, because in some ways we are now responding, and C-suite and boards are now really asking these questions like, are we good enough? What do we have to do? So holistic approach to digital from the corporate boardroom, looking at this beyond risk and compliance as a trust, as a sustainability thing. And I think we're going to see, I know ESG is not popular in some countries, but ESG is popular in some other countries. I mean, there's a lot of reporting taking place now in Europe. There are new rules. I hear from industry, lots of this will be tick the box, which is a shame, because we actually want the spirit of ESG to get bigger. But there is a link between data, digital, and ESG. And I think that link we need to also ride on. So I'm giving you areas where I see optimism, but it's going to be very bumpy ride as well.
Thanks, Bojana. So I'm going to exercise my chair's prerogative now to sum up very quickly before we open for questions. So we've heard these are big issues. There's a lot at stake. It's not all about national security. It's also about the opportunity cost and basic freedoms and a whole range of issues. And I think we've heard quite an optimistic view that we will get to a global compact, we'll get to an agreement on cybercrime. I think the question is whether or not that will actually make its way meaningfully into the world in a way that makes a difference. So I'm going to now open the floor. It'd be nice to take a mix of questions from the room and from online. Yes, sir. Hello.
Thank you, and thank you for a really interesting sort of discussion so far. It could be a whole day's conference if you unpacked the many issues there. Just one comment and then a question. Comment first, I thought it was fascinating where you referenced that data flows, sort of global data flows passing the trade in goods, which made me sort of think that perhaps with sort of data localization and digital sovereignty is an entirely rational solution to the lack of sort of global uniform privacy legislation, and dare I say it, tax avoidance by the tech sector, which is meaning it doesn't pay a fair societal contribution in the areas where it extracts the data, the sort of neocolonialism, as was mentioned. My question, though, internet standards and cybersecurity. So this is a sort of more of a tech-related question. The setting of internet standards is not a multi-stakeholder model. There's no reference to the policy impact of changes to internet standards. There's a strong focus on privacy in the internet standards body. Principally privacy from governments, because there's a strong sort of cyber libertarianism sort of theme in the standards body. Completely ignoring surveillance capitalism by the tech sector, which is arguably far worse than any privacy violations by many governments. And there's a false equivalence, in my view, between end-to-end encryption, privacy and security. They're three entirely different, unconnected things, but often the suggestion is that if you have end-to-end encryption, you have privacy, you have security, which in my view is entirely false. And it seems to me that that sort of end-to-end encryption model is potentially harming cybersecurity because it removes indicators of compromise and absolutely weakens privacy because it makes it impossible to tell if applications on my computer are communicating with the companies that wrote them, because I literally can't see if that communication is happening anymore because it's completely impossible technically to identify it. So my question then, should the multi-stakeholder model apply to internet standards, and do you agree that would be a good thing, and how would you envisage it working if you do? Thank you.
Should the multi-stakeholder model be applied? James, I'm going to come to you first. I know this is an area that prior to his departure from the National Cybersecurity Centre, Dr. Ian Levy was getting particularly exercised around the topic of standards, and a realisation that this was a contested space. And not only that, but as you say, there are so many dimensions to it. I think I might take you up on your kind of what's worse, libertarianism or surveillance capitalism versus other things. And we can take that discussion perhaps into the lunch session afterwards. But James, I'm going to come to you and ask for your view around the principle of should the multi-stakeholder model be, should we say, more aggressively applied in the world of international standards?
Yeah, I think there's obviously key experts here.
No, I just want to go after.
Okay. In terms of the point on the kind of people who are making the standards is just as important as the organizations they represent, right? So maybe, yes, there's not a multi-stakeholder forums like in the way that this is, or in the way that you have other technical governance bodies, but there are private sector representatives, there are people who have experience in private sector, and as you say, have a strong affinity with that kind of outlook. And so the question for me is really not, are they formally multi-stakeholder, but what perspectives are coming to the table? And if the perspectives are purely of one particular kind of state, that is a problem. If the perspectives are purely of one particular kind of corporation, that is also a problem. And I would question the distinction between surveillance capitalism as being less of a problem than state authoritarianism, because in many cases the two enable each other. So you can see that whether in my work in the Middle East or more widely. Now, the final point I'll make is on very briefly on encryption and cybersecurity, because I think that's where you sort of you went with the question. And in here, I will just very shamelessly draw completely on Bojana's point on balancing rights, because it's not clear that cybersecurity is always challenged by end-to-end encryption. In some ways it is, but that depends on the kind of cybersecurity you are hoping for, right? If you are a human rights defender whose communications are being read by an authoritarian government, end-to-end encryption is going to help you in that case, right? But then they're going to go to spyware companies to get access to the phone to get around end-to-end encryption. Complicated situation. If you're someone else if you're a corporation, in ways it might help you to justify privacy, data privacy for users' data that you hold. It might make it much harder for you to manipulate that data in ways that are entirely permitted, and also to conduct instant response or cybersecurity measures on that data as well. Right, again, not a clear situation.
Beyond,
so I just end there.
We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to come to you,
Later,
or we can move on.
Let's
Okay,
get more questions.
we have another question over here.
Yeah, thank you, Dominique. I'm a consultant. So to put it bluntly, Andrew's saying, should the IETF move beyond its view that Snowden is still a god? And that's, so that's the attendees in the IETF actually are just of one persuasion, whether they're private sector or civil society. I've been bullied, so I no longer attend anymore. However, in the UN, and what I'd like to actually really ask a question about with James and others is the negotiations I've done in the UN on internet policy on behalf of the government, but also as a private sector member previously, it's clear to me that the UN is not fit for purpose. So that post-Westphalian model does not work. It's corrupt. There's no accountability. I mean, I have many stories about it. There's a document in the ITU that shows, outgoing management just took cuts because they thought it, took a pay because they thought they could. So the question is the Global Digital Compact and the Tech Envoy and all these processes, which don't replace processes, but add on and on and on and cause money to be spent sort of without a limited budget. The Tech Envoy travels around the world. I don't even know what he does. I'm sure most of us don't even know. Is that the right system? How can we reform and change that from within? We're not going to get rid of the UN. I mean, in an ideal world, we would. But right now, the problem is what we need to do in terms of the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. How can we do negotiations in a system that's set in 1955? And I'd love to hear James and Bojana in particular, maybe in particular around data, because I think some of the other agencies, like the OECD, which is not a UN agency, right, and the private sector, the G20, G7, have done a lot of really good work. But the question is, internet policy making needs to be somewhere else, and I really want to hear your responses to that. Thanks.
I noticed you nodding vigorously when James touched upon this topic earlier on. Come to Bojana first.
Look, I mean, that's why we're saying we need new deal for data. We need a new, I mean, we actually looked into World Trade Organization, OECD, Council of Europe. I mean, there are so many things, but there isn't one place where this is all being discussed. And I don't know that UN actually does achieve this. And I wonder whether the way to do that is to start from smaller and then get bigger, from like-minded countries forming something that looks like some kind of, we have to start somewhere. I'm not very political when it comes to taking sides, and I don't believe in that in some ways. I think labels are not helpful very much, but because I've seen also lots of great work done by private sector in terms of standards, in terms of accountability, in terms of privacy technologies, and so we need to just get out of our shells and get the right people in the room. I mean, the ISO has been successful to some extent. Yes, people say it's private, but I mean, it has helped with security a lot. You can't now have a M&A deal, you can't have an IT service unless you actually are certified, ISO certified. These cross-border privacy rules that I talk about could become a model, because they're certifiable by third party, could become model for this new deal. But I think governments need to step up with the push from the private sector, like Davos. What does Davos talk about? They should be talking about this, right? This is what they should be talking about. So we want to put that on corporate agenda, and then the NGOs as well be more constructive and kind of want to work. Anyway, Chatham House can put us all together.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't have the answer. I'm just ranting.
I think we could probably have a full day conference on the UN's fitness for purpose in this space, but and we're probably not going to reform that now. But James, I'll pass to you.
Really quickly, I agree, multi-stakeholder participation in UN processes leaves much to be desired, right? OWG, visa issues, not aside, segmented sections, division between NGOs and corporations, so on. More generally, this point on the UN, it is a point about bureaucracy. It's a point about adding bureaucracy rather than taking it away. But for me, the real thing there is time, right? It takes a lot of time to do these things, and in that time, the world has changed. You can do a lot with the Budapest or with the ad hoc committee to try and make laws and conventions technology neutral. But if the landscape itself is changing quicker than the UN is, then that's only a surface fix. And then finally, in defense of the UN, one of the things I do say is that many global south and developing countries find it to be the only place where they get an equal hearing. And that is not really in defense of the UN, it's in criticism of every other form of governance that we take for granted in G7, G20, in big industrial economies.
I just wonder whether AI is going to change something, because there is such an interest in sort of regulating or thinking about AI at sort of multilateral level, and I wonder whether, it's not crazy what you hear from UK government, but there are others as well who are kind of saying we might need some kind of agency, we may need some fora, we may need maybe that will change things, because there is a little bit of this moral panic, but
I'm told we might have another couple of minutes I can see 3 questions in the room. We have Kieran over here, and we have a couple over here. I'll take. If we can take them all together,
Okay.
it's okay, and then we'll take them.
Dave Marcel again. Working with volunteers is a thing, so that's what BCS is about. I'll just remind you that longer term things are IRTF, Internet Research Task Force. That's possibly why you got short shrift to people that are busy on trying to get a protocol or do an operational thing. And that you are biased because it's an English language thing. So that will always bias against the likes of China. But we accept that, and there's always this group hum. But I'll encourage everyone in the room to join the IETF. Membership requires you subscribe to at least one mail list. And I've been a member since the 80s. So if you want to have that voice, I won't bully you. And if anyone does, I promise you, I'll have words if I ever see them again.
Very good. Some more over here.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think it's good that we are discussing these issues, and I can see that we have loads of issues that we really have to deal with. And I'm happy that the issue of GDC actually came up in the process of this discussion, so to say. And for me, I think Global Digital Compact is going to be, one big milestone that's going to help us to move forward. Why I'm saying that is because for us to take care of all these issues, the privacy, the digital industrial issues, and so many other issues, we need a one-stop shop that's going to take care of everything. And at the same time, it's going to be inclusive. And I also believe that the issue of multi-stakeholderism, it's a big deal when we're talking about all these things, because the issue is that it goes beyond just the government, it goes beyond just even the private, organizations. We have to talk about the, the non-government, the not-for-profit organizations too. The tech community has to be involved, and so on and so forth. And even the disabled, the disabilities has to be taken care of. So I believe so much in the fact that we need to go in the way of, multi-stakeholder. That's when we can have a robust solution, and perhaps GDC is something that we really need to expedite action on, so that probably maybe it's going to take care of all those issues, coming together. But that's just my own personal opinion. I don't know if anybody will agree with me on that. Thank you.
Good points. Thank you. I'm going to come over here finally to Kieran. Kieran, you had a question.
Yes. Hi, Kieran McCarthy. So yeah, this is the UKIGF. So my question is, what can the UK pragmatically do? Should the UK government involve itself more in UN processes or OECD processes? Should UK industry come up with solutions that work, that can be shown to the rest of the world? Should UK policymakers push for how we create global compacts? What can we pragmatically do?
It's a good question. In fact, we had hoped to have had Baroness Udin here today, who was going to talk specifically to the role of the UK. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it at the last minute, but we'll endeavour to speak for the UK on this matter. Bojana, would you like
Can
to
do
first?
huge things. UK can do, and I think UK is trying to do quite a lot. What I see from my interactions with various pieces of government, lots of these kind of new regulatory ideas like DRCF, putting all these regulators together so they can think in a multilateral way. Regulatory sandboxes. I sit on the Expert Council for Data Flows, which is now going to come up with a paper that is hopefully going to push some of these ideas to others. I actually think AI, I hear UK government is doing things on AI, so I think UK government can do a lot, and I feel there is a need, I sense there is a increased interest by the government to push the digital agenda, but of course they need to hear from all of you, us, and industry and SMEs and startups, why this matters for the UK PLC and people, us as people, as citizens. I think they're still looking for evidence and for stories, and that's my sense. But I feel the UK is trying to put that leadership cap on, together with some others.
Thank you, Bojana. Unless there are, I'm told we are out of time, and therefore I'm terribly sorry, but I am all that stands between you and lunch, and we don't want mass hunger breaking out. So first of all, I'm going to say thank you very much to our two panelists and ask you to show your appreciation. Thank you very much.